The year is 1963. A mailman in suburban Chicago delivers a package to a modest home on Elm Street. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled paper and cosmoline, lies a German carabiner 98K rifle, the same weapon carried by Wehrmacht soldiers across Europe 20 years earlier. The homeowner paid $19.95. No background check, no waiting period. Just a coupon clipped from a magazine and a money order sent to an importer in Alexandria, Virginia. By 1968, over 5 million military surplus rifles from World War II had flooded into American homes through mail-order catalogs and newspaper advertisements. Mausers, Mosins, Springfields, Enfields, weapons that had witnessed D-Day, Stalingrad, and the fall of Berlin now hung above fireplaces in Kansas and Texas. Then, on October 22, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Gun Control Act into law. The golden age of mail-order military rifles ended instantly. Imports ceased. Distributors closed their warehouses. The pipeline shut down. But the war was over, this war at least. A new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to those 5 million rifles after the mailbox door closed for the last time? Between 1958 and 1968, America experienced an unprecedented phenomenon in firearms history. Military surplus rifles became as common in American households as baseball gloves and lawnmowers. Conservative estimates suggest that approximately 5.2 million military surplus rifles entered the United States through mail order and direct importation during this decade. The actual number may exceed 6 million. These weren't reproductions or commemorative pieces. These were authentic combat weapons, many still bearing the marks of battle. Dents in the stocks, scratches on the metal, serial numbers that could be traced back to specific factories in wartime Germany, Russia, or Japan. The phenomenon began in earnest after the Korean War, when the US military transitioned to the M14 rifle and began releasing vast stockpiles of obsolete weapons. Simultaneously, European nations were modernizing their militaries and offloading their World War II inventory. American importers saw an opportunity. Companies like Interarms, Century Arms, and Potomac Arms established massive operations to bring these rifles into the United States. The rifles arrived by the shipload at ports in Baltimore, New York, and New Orleans. Picture warehouses the size of aircraft hangars, stacked floor to ceiling with wooden crates. Each crate contained 20 rifles packed in grease so thick it required gasoline to remove. The advertisements appeared everywhere. The back pages of Popular Mechanics, American Rifleman, and Field and Stream featured full-page spreads. Genuine German Mauser K98, $29.95. Russian Mosin-Nagant, only $19.50. Swiss Schmidt-Rubin, $39.95 with bayonet. Some ads offered package deals. For $75, a buyer could receive 3 different rifles from 3 different countries. The language in these advertisements now seems surreal. Arm yourself with history, one importer proclaimed. Another offered battlefield pickup rifles, implying these weapons had been collected directly from combat zones. The process was absurdly simple. A buyer would fill out a coupon, include a money order, and mail it to an address in Virginia or Maryland. 2 weeks later, the rifle arrived at their doorstep. In some cases, the mailman would hand-deliver a 5-foot-long package containing a loaded military rifle. No identification required, no questions asked. A teenager with paper route money could legally purchase a weapon that had killed soldiers on the Eastern Front. Then came 1968, a year of political assassinations and urban unrest. The murders of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy shocked the nation. Congress responded with the Gun Control Act, the most comprehensive firearms legislation in American history. Title I of the Act prohibited the interstate shipment of firearms to individuals. Title II restricted the importation of military surplus weapons. The law didn't ban ownership of these rifles, but it effectively ended their mail-order sale and severely restricted new imports. President Johnson signed the bill into law on October 22, 1968. The next day, the advertisements disappeared from magazines. The warehouses in Alexandria went silent. Imagine walking through one of those import warehouses in late October 1968. The smell of cosmoline hangs heavy in the air. Wooden crates are stacked 30 feet high. Some bear Cyrillic markings. Others show German eagles. In the corner, a shipment of Japanese Arisaka rifles waits to be processed. They never will be. The doors close. The lights go out. But this is where the story truly begins. The immediate aftermath saw a frantic scramble. Importers had 60 days to comply with the new regulations. Some companies worked around the clock to process pending orders. Others simply abandoned their inventory. In Alexandria, Virginia, one warehouse contained an estimated 200,000 rifles that would never be sold. Workers were instructed to prepare them for destruction. Picture men in coveralls, standing before mountains of military history, knowing that by week's end these weapons would be crushed into scrap metal. But destruction wasn't the only option. The law contained loopholes. Rifles classified as curios and relics could still be imported under certain conditions. This created a bizarre secondary market. Importers began modifying rifles to meet the new criteria. Some companies sporterized the weapons, cutting down the military stocks and adding commercial-style furniture. A German Mauser that had stormed through Poland in 1939 would be stripped of its military character, transformed into a hunting rifle, and sold through gun shops instead of mail order. Thousands of rifles simply disappeared into private collections during this transition period. Dealers who saw the ban coming stockpiled inventory. In rural Pennsylvania, one importer purchased an entire warehouse before the law took effect. He moved 50,000 rifles to a converted barn on his property. For the next 30 years, he quietly sold them at gun shows, one transaction at a time. When he died in 1998, his family discovered that he still had 8,000 rifles remaining. That single cache represented more firepower than some small armies possessed. Other rifles took stranger journeys. In 1969, a shipping container of Italian Carcano rifles, the same model used to assassinate President Kennedy, sat unclaimed at a Baltimore dock. The importer had gone bankrupt. The rifles couldn't be sold domestically anymore. They couldn't be returned to Italy. For 2 years, the container sat in a customs warehouse. Eventually, the rifles were sold to a scrap dealer for their metal content. They were melted down and reformed into rebar used in the construction of a shopping mall in Bethesda, Maryland. The international repercussions were equally dramatic. Countries that had relied on American buyers to purchase their surplus inventory suddenly had no market. In the early 1970s, the French government possessed over 500,000 obsolete MAS 36 rifles in storage. Without American importers, there was no economically viable way to dispose of them. The French military explored several options. Some rifles were given as military aid to former colonies in Africa. Others were sold to South American nations. Many were simply destroyed. In 1974, photographs emerged of a massive bonfire in Marseille, where French soldiers burned tens of thousands of wooden rifle stocks. The metal components were melted down for scrap. The Soviet Union faced a similar problem. By 1970, the USSR had modernized its military and possessed an estimated 8 million obsolete Mosin-Nagant rifles in storage. Before 1968, American importers had been purchasing these weapons for as little as $3 each. After the ban, that market evaporated. The Soviets initially stockpiled the rifles for potential civilian militia use during the Cold War. Massive warehouses in Siberia and the Urals contained floor-to-ceiling stacks of rifles wrapped in paper and grease. These warehouses remained sealed for decades. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Those warehouses became the property of the Russian Federation. In the chaos of the 1990s, some of these rifles entered the international black market. They appeared in conflicts across Africa and the Middle East. A weapon manufactured in Ijevsk in 1943 to fight the Wehrmacht might end up in the hands of a rebel soldier in Somalia 50 years later. The 1968 ban hadn't destroyed these rifles, it had merely redirected their flow. Back in America, the 5 million rifles that had entered the country before 1968 began their own complex journeys. Many became family heirlooms. The rifles passed from fathers to sons, often accompanied by stories that grew more elaborate with each generation. A typical narrative. Your grandfather bought this rifle for $20. It was carried by a German soldier at the Battle of the Bulge. Whether or not this was true became irrelevant. The rifle represented a tangible connection to the most significant conflict in human history. Other rifles entered the sporting goods market. Millions of Americans in the 1970s and 1980s learned to hunt with military surplus rifles. The weapons were cheap, reliable, and powerful. In Montana and Wyoming, it was common to see ranchers carrying sporterized Mausers. The rifles that had fought in the wheat fields of Ukraine now pursued elk in the Rocky Mountains. Some purists lamented this transformation. Bubba's gunsmithing became a derisive term for amateur modifications that destroyed the historical integrity of these weapons. A pristine K98 worth several $100s would be irreversibly altered into a crude hunting rifle worth far less. The collector market exploded in the 1980s. As the generation that fought World War II aged, interest in military memorabilia surged. The rifles that had seemed commonplace in 1965 were now increasingly rare. A German Mauser that sold for $30 in 1968 might fetch $300 by 1985. Pristine examples commanded even higher prices. This created an incentive to preserve rather than modify. Attics and basements across America contained forgotten rifles that suddenly had significant value. Strange discoveries became commonplace. In 1987, a construction crew demolishing an old warehouse in Detroit found a walled-off room containing 427 Russian Mosin-Nagant rifles. The building had once housed a surplus dealer who went bankrupt in 1969. Rather than surrendering his inventory, he had hidden it behind a false wall. The rifles had sat undisturbed for 18 years. In 1993, a farmer in Iowa was digging a new foundation when his excavator struck a large metal container. Inside were 73 Japanese Arisaka rifles, still packed in their original Cosmoline. The previous owner of the property had been a mail-order dealer who apparently buried his inventory to avoid the 1968 restrictions. The most remarkable discovery occurred in 2004. A storage facility in New Jersey was being cleared after the death of its owner. Workers found a climate-controlled room containing over 2,000 rifles from 14 different countries, all carefully catalogued and preserved. The deceased had been a quiet accountant who had spent 40 years secretly assembling one of the most comprehensive collections of World War II military rifles in private hands. His family had no idea the collection existed. The rifles were eventually auctioned, bringing over $3 million. Museums became repositories for the finest examples. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans actively sought out rare variants and pristine specimens. The Smithsonian expanded its firearms collection significantly in the 1990s, recognizing that these mass-produced weapons were rapidly becoming historical artifacts. Curators faced an interesting question. How do you display a rifle that millions of Americans own? The answer was to focus on provenance. A standard-issue Mosin-Nagant isn't particularly noteworthy, but one documented to have been used at the Siege of Leningrad becomes historically significant. The international situation continued to evolve. In the late 1990s, the United States began allowing limited imports of military surplus rifles again under modified regulations. The rifles now had to meet sporting purposes criteria and importers faced significantly more paperwork. This opened a new chapter. In 2009, approximately 87,000 M1 Garand rifles were imported from South Korea, where they had been provided as military aid in the 1950s. These rifles had traveled from American factories to Korean battlefields and back to American collectors 60 years later. The global market became increasingly complex. Chinese Type 53 rifles, copies of the Soviet Mosin-Nagant, flooded into America during the 1990s. These weren't World War II weapons, but they were built from the same design. They sold for as little as $70 each, roughly the same price as their predecessors had commanded 30 years earlier, when adjusted for inflation. Then, in 2000, the Clinton administration banned the import of Chinese military firearms, and that pipeline closed as well. Eastern European nations became major sources in the 2000s. After joining NATO, countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland decommissioned their Soviet-era weapons. American importers snapped up the inventory. However, these rifles faced a different fate than their 1960s predecessors. The 1968 law remained in effect. The rifles couldn't be mailed to individual homes. Instead, they had to be shipped to licensed dealers, who would then transfer them to buyers after background checks. The convenience and anonymity of the mail-order era was gone forever. By 2010, the demographics of ownership had shifted dramatically. The generation that bought rifles from magazine advertisements in the 1960s was retiring or dying. Their children faced a choice: keep the rifles, sell them, or surrender them. Many chose to sell. Gun shows became venues where these weapons changed hands. A typical scene at a Virginia gun show in 2015. Elderly veterans manning tables covered with rifles, each weapon tagged with a handwritten card explaining its history. Russian Mosin-Nagant, Tula Arsenal 1943, $250. German K98, all matching numbers, $850. The rifles that arrived by mail for $20 now required four-figure investments for premium examples. Some estimates suggest that of the original 5 million-plus rifles imported before 1968, approximately 3.8 million remain in circulation in the United States today. The missing 1.2 million have been destroyed, lost, surrendered, or exported. Every year, more disappear. House fires consume collections. Heirs who don't appreciate their value sell rifles to buyback programs for $50 gift cards. Others rust away in forgotten storage units. The legal landscape continued to tighten. In 2014, the Obama administration prohibited the re-importation of American-made M1 carbines from South Korea, nearly 600,000 rifles that the US had provided as military aid decades earlier. These weapons remain in storage in South Korea, prohibited from returning to their country of origin. In Russia, millions of Mosin-Nagant rifles still sit in military warehouses, now considered too politically sensitive to export to civilian markets. The cultural impact of these rifles extends beyond mere ownership. An entire industry emerged to support them. Companies manufacture reproduction parts, allowing owners to restore modified rifles to their original military configuration. Websites and forums dedicated to specific models attract thousands of members who share knowledge about markings, variations, and history. YouTube channels devoted to military surplus firearms regularly attract millions of views. The rifles have become educational tools, tangible links to studying World War II history. Educational institutions have recognized this value. Some high schools with JROTC programs use deactivated surplus rifles for drill practice. Museums offer hands-on programs where visitors can handle authentic weapons under supervision. Academic researchers study the rifles to understand manufacturing techniques, wartime production shortcuts, and the evolution of small arms technology. A rifle manufactured in a Czech factory in 1939, used by German forces in 1940, captured by the Soviets in 1945, shipped to America in 1963, and now residing in a private collection in Tennessee, has witnessed more history than most textbooks contain. The preservation challenges are significant. Cosmoline, the thick grease used to protect rifles during storage, preserves metal but accelerates wood deterioration over decades. Many rifles from the 1960s import wave now suffer from cracked stocks and corroded barrels due to improper storage by owners who didn't understand preservation requirements. Climate-controlled environments are essential, but most private owners lack such facilities. In another 50 years, experts predict that fewer than half of the surviving rifles will remain in collectible condition. International politics continue to influence availability. In 2019, tensions between the United States and Russia led to discussions about banning all Russian firearms imports, which would include the few remaining channels for military surplus. The relationship between Turkey and the United States has affected the availability of Turkish Mausers. Ethiopian stores of Italian rifles from the 1930s occasionally surface, only to be blocked by import restrictions. Each geopolitical shift potentially closes another door on the dwindling supply. The prices reflect this scarcity. A Chinese Type 53 carbine that sold for $70 in 1995 now commands $250. German K98 rifles in excellent condition regularly exceed $1,500. Rare variants can bring five-figure sums. A matching numbers German sniper rifle sold at auction in 2018 for $47,000. The financial incentive to preserve these weapons has never been higher, which ironically ensures better long-term survival rates than the casual neglect of the mail-order era. Some rifles have taken unexpected paths into popular culture. The 2001 film Enemy at the Gates sparked renewed interest in Soviet sniper rifles. Video games like Call of Duty introduced younger generations to these weapons virtually before they encountered them physically. This cross-generational appeal has created a new demographic of collectors, millennials and Gen Z enthusiasts who view these rifles as both historical artifacts and practical firearms. Today, walking into a well-stocked gun show reveals the remarkable persistence of these weapons. Tables display rifles from dozens of nations, each representing a different chapter of World War II history. Japanese Arisakas that island-hopped across the Pacific. Italian Carcanos from the North African campaign. French MAS-36 rifles that witnessed both occupation and liberation. British Lee Enfields from every theatre of war. The diversity is staggering, a physical manifestation of the war's global scope. Yet the numbers tell a story of slow disappearance. Importers report that each year brings fewer opportunities to acquire significant quantities. The warehouses are empty. The armies have modernized. The veterans who captured these rifles as souvenirs have largely passed away. The pipeline that brought 5 million rifles to America in a single decade has slowed to a trickle. Current annual imports of World War II military rifles number in the low thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. The future remains uncertain. Legislative efforts periodically emerge to further restrict military surplus imports. States like California and Massachusetts have enacted laws making ownership more burdensome. Federal agencies have proposed regulations that would classify certain variants as prohibited. Each new restriction accelerates the transition from common goods to rare collectibles. In attics across America, rifles still rest in their original shipping boxes from 1963, unopened for 60 years. In basements, they lean in corners, their wood stocks darkened with age, their metal showing the patina of time. In museums, they occupy display cases labeled and catalogued, removed from their original purpose, but preserved for study. In private collections, they represent investments, hobbies, and connections to history. The 5 million rifles that arrived in American mailboxes between 1958 and 1968 have scattered across the landscape of this nation like seeds from a dandelion. Some took root and flourished, carefully maintained across generations. Others withered through neglect or were harvested for parts. Many remain dormant, waiting in forgotten spaces to be rediscovered. But they persist, these instruments of war repurposed as tools of sport, education, and remembrance. The 1968 Gun Control Act closed a chapter in American history that will never reopen. No future generation will experience the strange thrill of receiving a battle-worn rifle in the mail for the price of a few movie tickets. The logistics, the legality, and the cultural moment have all passed. What remains are the rifles themselves, slowly appreciating in value as they depreciate in number, each one a small monument to the industrialized warfare that defined the 20th century. These weapons once symbolized humanity's capacity for mass destruction. Now they symbolize something else: the transformation of swords into plowshares, the domestication of war, the long, slow process by which history becomes heritage. The mailman will never again deliver such packages to American doorsteps. The warehouses will not refill. The advertisements will not return. But the rifles remain, 5 million scattered fragments of the world's greatest conflict, slowly fading into the past while stubbornly persisting in the present.